So we have a double portion this morning, Acharei Mot Kedoshim, which always makes it harder in the span of an hour to try to figure out what exactly to teach. I thought we'd look at Acharei Mot, right? Literally means after the death. For anybody that's either read ahead or just knows where we are in the Torah, anybody know whose death we're after? Huh?
Moses.
Not Moses. No. Moses is the end. That's Joshua. Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, right? They in last week's parsha, they bring these offerings that they were not told to bring, right? They sort of decide, there's something to be said about entrepreneurial spirit, and as it relates to Torah, is maybe like a big no. But the Torah is very prescribed in when to do things and when not to do things, and even if it's something that is welcome, when it's not requested or not done at the prescribed time, that can be very dangerous. And so what I thought we'd talk about a little bit today is also we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but the nature of holiness, because this is kind of in this week's double portion, we really see kind of both sides of holiness, right? The beauty of it, right? This idea of Kedoshim Tihiyu, you should be holy because I, God, am holy, right? We have, because perhaps we're created with the divine image, in the divine image, or with a spark of the divine within us, like we are holy because God is holy. And so that's Kedoshim, really is the focal point of that. But Acharei Mot kind of deals with the aftermath of this kind of dangerous encounter with the power of Kedusha, the power of holiness as well, and how things can go wrong when the incredible power of the most holy isn't properly appreciated. It's sort of like trying to pick up a nuclear reactor core with your bare hands, right? I hate when that happens, right? Yeah, it ruins your manicure, at the very least. It's like flesh melting sort of situation. So we're going to look at that, and also it's worth noting that that more broadly, I think part of why Acharei Mot and Kedoshim, right? It's interesting to sort of think about what logic perhaps the rabbis had in deciding which portions actually get paired with each other when there's a double Torah portion. And these two go together in part because chapter 17, which falls in Acharei Mot, really is seen by most scholars as the beginning of the holiness code. And so that's where the holiness code really kind of stems from chapter 17 through chapter 20. Is kind of this section of the Torah understood as the holiness code, because it's all sorts of laws and regulations that seem to be focused on this idea of holiness. And on some level, many of them include this justification, like you're going to do this thing because I am God, which is an interesting, right? It's almost like a parent saying, you're going to brush your teeth because I said so, or you have to do this because I'm your parent, which is both not a particularly compelling argument and simultaneously an incredibly compelling argument, perhaps depending on your perspective in that debate. So let's dive in. Let me share my screen here.
Rabbi, why were they broken up in the first place?
That's a good question. Part of it, look, I mean, on some level, the rabbis divided the parshiot into 54, divided the Torah into 54 parshiot. And so you kind of had to draw a line somewhere. And I think there was probably a recognition, even as they were dividing the portions, that there would be years in which some of them were paired with each other. So I think they tried to kind of, I wasn't there in the debate room, but But my sense is that they tried to kind of keep things thematically connected, that there's somewhat discrete sections, but not always. That sometimes the lines feel a little bit arbitrary. Let's go Barbara and then Ellen. Oh, I don't know. Ellen's got there.
Shabbat Shalom, Barbara Ilowski. So in the leap year Adars, when Adar is repeated, do they repeat the Torah portions from the previous Adar?
No, so that's one of the reasons there are 54 parshiot is that right, if there's a leap year, we get a whole extra month, so it's 4 extra weeks of Torah readings. But right, and we know 52 weeks in a year, but when there are holidays that fall, either holidays that fall on Shabbat or like during Sukkot or Pesach, for example, that are 7 or 8 day holidays, there are special Torah readings for some of those holidays. So it's not like there are always 52 weeks in which we're reading the weekly Torah portion. There are some other moments that throw that kind of regular weekly cycle off. So what they do is they uncouple when there's a leap year, they uncouple those double portions, and they're just read 1 week after, right? Like, so I think next year is a leap year. So suddenly, a year from now, the holidays will feel very late. But next year, this week would be Acharei Mot, and the following would be Kedoshim. Ellen.
Good morning, Ellen Ratner. On the screen, you have Leviticus 16, and in my Chumash, it's Kiddushim is on 19.
You are correct, because we're starting with Acharei Mot.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so we're gonna start at towards the beginning of Acharei Mot to kind of look at this moment that Aaron in particular is in, and sort of talk a little bit about this idea of holiness, and then do I have us going to? I don't think we're going all the way to into Kedoshim, but yes. Okay, so can I get somebody to read for me verses 1 through 3 of chapter 16? Great, Jeff. Elaine, go for it.
Oh, Elaine, yeah, that's fine. Let Elaine do.
Oh, okay. Leviticus 16:1-3. The Eternal spoke to Moses after the death of the 2 sons of Aaron who died when they drew too close to the presence of the Eternal. The Eternal said to Moses, "Tell your brother Aaron that he is not to come at will into the shrine behind the curtain in front of the cover that is upon the ark, lest he die. For I appear in the cloud over the cover. Thus only shall Aaron enter the shrine with a bull of the herd for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering."
So there's this interesting kind of for context of chapter 16. There's this interesting dynamic. The JPS commentary talks about this dynamic interaction between the priesthood and the community on the one hand, and the sort of the omnipresence and power of God on the other. Out of love for God's people Israel, God manifests God's presence among them, but only on condition that the Israelite sanctuary be maintained in a state of purity. God's forgiveness coming at the end of the expiatory process can be anticipated only after the purification of the sanctuary is satisfactorily accomplished. So it's really, this is kind of, this section and the previous section are really kind of the sort of beginning of the gears of the sacrificial system kind of grinding to a start. Right, they're getting going, and there are some kinks in the system a little bit. Right, we see Nadav and Avihu. I wouldn't dismiss them as kinks in the system, but the sense of how do we relate to the sense of holiness and to what's going on here. And part of this is also the way in which, so not only is it when Aaron's allowed to come into, right? And keep in mind, Aaron is the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, right? This is the guy, right? Moses is having conversations with God, and just next to Moses, the next person that can have an intimate relationship with God is in a very different ritual sort of way, is Aaron. Yeah, Jeff.
Jeff Carmel. At the end of that passage, it says they bring in a bull for a sin offering, and I assume that implies a sin of the entire congregation. Everyone does their little part in that. And the other is a ram for a burnt offering. What is the difference?
One's a cow and one's a sheep. No, yeah, that's a good question. Well, the burnt offering is, look, there are two different categories of offerings, right? I think that you're right that this idea of a sin offering, there are different kinds of rituals for particularly for preparing the priests for making sacrifices, right? So usually, like if you think about and we're going to look at like the goat for Azazel in a moment, because this is where it's kind of first mentioned, which is part of the ritual leading up to the Yom Kippur ritual in the Holy of Holies, right? That's the one moment in which the high priest approaches the Holy of Holies. And what's interesting about that is there are, to your assumption that you were making, which is correct, right? This idea of a sin offering, really there are two offerings that the priest makes before doing that, and one is cleansing himself of any sin, and so it's an interesting question because I think in part it's keep in mind that in the Torah there are offerings for both sort of, I would say, active sins, right? You insulted somebody, you slugged your friend in an unwarranted fashion, as opposed to kind of a sin of sins of omission and sins of commission, right? The more passive sins are things that perhaps you maybe didn't do something that you could have done, right, or should have done. So it's kind of a way of it's a little bit of a catch-all. Let's see, Elaine, and then Larry, Jeff, and Harv, and then Ellen, and then Giora.
So
I don't remember what that order was. Sorry.
yeah, so I know we've spent a lot of time talking about the death of Nadav and Abihu and why, but what's interesting here is this phrase, and I don't know what the Hebrew is, but the translation, when they drew too close, they died because they drew too close to the presence of Adonai, of the Eternal. And that doesn't sound to me the same as they brought alien fire, they may have been inebriated. This is they died because they got too close. That seems to me a very different interpretation.
Yeah, and it's also an interesting question, right? Like, don't we want to be close to God?
And what does it mean to be too close? Like, isn't the purpose of the high priest is that they're supposed to, under very controlled circumstances, get close to God and perform their function? But I've never, and it could be the wrong time, but they got too close. That's different.
Well, it's interesting. Your point is an interesting one. Look, this I think it speaks also to the power of translation and how it changes. The word "to" is not present
Yeah.
in the Hebrew, right? It's bakarvatam lifnei Adonai v'yamutu. They drew close, so it's an interesting. There's a little bit of subjectivity here that they drew too close. On some level, it was that they approached the divine in a moment in which they weren't requested, right? And your point, Elaine, about alien fire, I think, is a good one. That it's not mentioned here, which is the justification that's given earlier. But it's an interesting question, right? It's yeah. Okay, I think I said, what did I say? I said Larry, Jeff, Ellen, and Giora. And
So,
then, Larry, Jeff, Harv, Ellen, Giora. Yeah.
Larry Shapiro, Shabbat Shalom. What I find curious about this is that just in the previous chapter in Leviticus 15, the Lord speaks to both Moses and Aaron. And actually, that's the second and only time. These two times, one is in Leviticus 11. This is according to Sepharia. In 11, it is about eating the right animals. And in 15, it's about um, uh, sexual immorality. But in this one, even though it's clearly something that's related to Aaron and his offspring, God doesn't speak directly to Aaron, which seems surprising to me. And so it sort of raises the question: is God still angry at Aaron over the golden calf? And I would suspect that that's part of the problem. But also, it lends itself to this. You know, God speaks to Moses, Moses speaks to the Aaron and the people, and there's sort of this indirect communication, which certainly is, it's the old game of telephone. It can be misinterpreted, or for that matter, it just can be interpreted. And so that it allows for some things to go in a different direction. What's interesting is that in the other two instances, it's pretty clear. I mean, the Lord spoke to both of them at the same time.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think that's sort of an interesting read. I don't know that it's clear as to why in a given moment, God chooses who God speaks to. It's a good question. Okay, Jeff, Harv, Ellen, Giora.
yeah, quick comment. I too thought that the son's death was related to Aaron and the golden calf. I think when we discussed it, this is one of the things that people said was going to happen because Aaron had the golden calf. My question is, why the bull and why the let's see, a bull and
And the ram.
a ram? What have the rabbis said about this?
That's a good question. That's a good question. What have the rabbis said about this? Why a bull and why a ram? See if I can find an answer. Let's keep going. Harv, what's your question? I'm going to see if I can come up with an answer. Well,
the question is related to what was just said. I have a problem with that last sentence. Maybe it's the translation. Thus only shall Aaron enter the shrine with a bull of the herd and a ram. Now, can you imagine one guy taking a bull and a ram into this small opening, which is the where the Holy of Holies is supposed to be? I can't imagine that.
I assume that he had like an assistant or a young apprentice or one of the Levites.
Is the translation accurate?
He shall bring a bull, yeah, and a ram.
Okay. He can't have an associate.
Well, yeah, it doesn't say he by himself. It just says
but
only he shall. So here to respond, Ibn Ezra does kind of comment on recognizes that. Ibn Ezra says, with a young bull, its meaning is not that Aaron should bring the bull into the holy place, but rather that he first bring the bull of his own for a sin offering to atone for himself and the Kohanim. Others say also for the Levites, for they found, and thou shalt write Aaron's name upon the rod of Levi in Numbers. However, this is far-fetched, says Ibn Ezra. On the contrary, the Levites are considered among the Israelites. So this is really the thing to keep in mind that Rashi points out, which I neglected to say, and Jeff, you actually pointed to this. Really, this isn't just The only time that Aaron's going into the Holy of Holies is Yom Kippur. Right? This is a one shot deal. And so part of this is also, you're not coming willy-nilly whenever you want. It's one thing to make offerings, you're gonna take care of that, but you're entering this holiest place in this one particular moment that is highly prescribed with all these rituals that you're gonna have done to really make sure that you come in the right mindset, to come ritually pure, to come having made all of these sacrifices. So the sacrifices aren't done in the Holy of Holies. It's that you're only although you're right, if you read it pretty literally, it's Bezot Yavo Aaron El HaKodesh with the like thus will Aaron come to the holy site HaKodesh, right? Befar ben Bakar with a bull of a young bull as a sin offering, ve'ayil le'olan. But it doesn't say whether he's coming into that space. I don't know. It reads like he's coming into the space, right? Dahlia, what do you think?
He doesn't.
Oh, hold on. Let's give Dahlia a mic first.
I got one other question.
Okay.
The other question is, how did Aaron's sons die? Was it essentially a stroke? Did they burn up? Did they?
They were consumed by this fire. I mean, I think I tend to think about this moment for anybody that's seen Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's my image a little bit, right? Is this sort of like the holy fire kind of comes from the pans that they're offering and consumes them.
I would just point out that if phosphorus touches the body, the whole body can burn,
There you go.
just like a candle. So
there you go. So perhaps it was something about what they were offering, not just and the materials they were working with. All right, can you pass the mic back? And Dahlia, well, it's going back to Ellen.
Yes, I just wanted to say that reading the Hebrew naked without any interpretation, when I'm reading it, befar bakar, it doesn't say im par bakar. It doesn't say he entered the Kodesh Kodashim together with those animals. And bepar in Hebrew can be after he paid his dues, after he did what. So bepar are his keys to enter the Kodesh Kodashim. So he have done that. Now he can go to Kodesh Kodashim. So like that's just for my poor Hebrew memory.
No, your Hebrew's pretty good, Dahlia.
But this is kind of
I don't know if anybody's told you, but your Hebrew's pretty good.
But maybe
right. No, that I think that
come from interpretation from that particular verse. I don't know what comes first, but the way I read it, naked, just the Hebrew, befar bakar, he paid what he need to do. He have done everything, and now he can go into that.
Yeah, I like that. It is interesting. All the translations that I'm seeing are saying with, but I think that you're right, that there's it's not like he's carting the bull into the Holy of Holies. He's approaching it perhaps with the bull, but the ritual's done out here, and then he's going in on his own. All right, Ellen, go ahead. All the way in the back.
Oh.
We need like a drone microphone or something.
Ellen Teffin, I have a question. Where do they obtain the ram and the bull? Does this imply that that Aaron had his own herd?
Not necessarily.
Because, here he is doing priestly duties, and he's also maintaining himself with a herd of animals.
At a minimum, the Levites probably were the one that were tending a flock that perhaps were like the possession of the priests, perhaps. And they could have come from a number of different sources, right? There are all sorts of different moments that are prescribed in which the Israelites are offering animals to various sacrifices and animals to the priesthood as kind of a essentially a tax, right? As part of their tithing. I would assume that we're talking about the Israelites. It's always interesting, I think, for me in my head, to just remind myself that we're talking about the Israelites wandering through the desert here and not get kind of like jump. There's sort of a
They're not
conflation.
in farmland at
Right.
all, so they have to travel with this.
Right. And also, I think in my head, sometimes there's a conflation between the rituals here and the rituals in the temple, right? Which, the temple in Jerusalem, because they're the same rituals, but here they're wandering. But the understanding is that they are traveling with flocks and with herds of, there are animals in the midst of the resources that the Israelites are traveling with. And it's not impossible to think that the Levites, as a tribe, had their own herd of these animals that they were keeping and raising, and
So they would donate it to the priests,
yeah,
possibly.
right. Either they're donated or perhaps they. My sense is it probably was donated from somewhere else, but I'm not entirely certain. Yora.
Thank you. I'm not sure what I'm saying now directly related to what you're discussing, but you use the term Kedoshim or holiness several times, and it reminded me a discussion that I heard on Zoom last week related to Yom Ha'atzmaut by Hartman Institute. They talk a lot about the terms Kedoshim or Kedushat Haaretz, or holiness of the earth, and Kedushat life, the life things. So, and they say that throughout all the generation of the Jewish things, there is the rabbis always struggle between the term Kedusha, Kedushat Haaretz or Kedushat alive, of the life or of the things. And this related to Yom Ha'atzmaut, and now Jewish related to Israel, to the land, over the generation, from at the Torah time, the Kedusha, the holiness of the land was very important, and they're going to fight there. Later on, the rabbis changed it. It's not important, the land, but more important life, Kedushat life. Right. And nowadays, we're going back in Israel to land. So all of this discussion between rabbis over the generation about holiness and Kedusha, it's just on my mind.
No, and it makes sense, right? Because the rabbi's project was galut, right? It was diaspora. It was being expelled, and they there. And it's interesting if you think about the initial reaction of the rabbis after the destruction of the temple is, we don't need sacrifices anymore. And it's interesting because sacrifices are tied to the land in two ways. Sacrifices happen in one particular place, right? One geographic place in the land, right? In the temple in Jerusalem. But also, they're also very much of the land, right? You need that agriculture and pastoral, right? The animals and the bounty, like that is coming from, there's an interesting question about whether or not the Shemitah, right? The year in which, right, where you let the land lay fallow every seventh year, is that just in Israel? Does it apply everywhere? Most of the rabbis, I think, say it's just in Israel, and outside the land, it's not the Kedushat Haaretz, the holiness of the land, isn't like, Northern California, while it's very beautiful, it's not Kedusha, it's not holy, right? Because think about the idea, the root concept of Kedusha is, we use these words holy, sacred, like they're kind of, we know they're important, but it's not just important. Kedusha really is, if you look at the first place that Kedusha appears in the Torah, it's in the context of creation. And which day is called holy? It's the seventh day, right? So it's not a place, it's a time, right? The seventh day, the day of Shabbat, is holy. And why is it holy? It's set apart from the rest of creation, right? It's this idea of Kedusha is something that is unique, something that is special, something that's separate, something that's set apart. And so, we're talking about kind of the power of the sacred, the power of the kadosh or of kedusha, but it doesn't just mean important. Kedushat haaretz also means, this land and not any other land, right? Like it's different. Rabbi Navi was talking about, the reactions that people would have to her in Israel, right? Israel is not Uganda, or Uganda is not Israel, right? If there had been a Jewish state established in Uganda, the Jews still would have had a relationship in some way, shape, or form, at least on a spiritual level, with the land of Israel, right? Even if they weren't there, it would have still been the place where they directed their prayers, right? Because Jerusalem and Israel is so, right? That is Kedushat haaretz. It's the holiness of the land, and then the question is like, how do those two play into each other, right? The holiness of the land versus the sanctity of human life. It's an interesting question. Oriella, since you're closest, and then we'll go to Shelley, and then we'll go to Ellen.
Thank you, Rabbi. In my mind, and I was thinking about it this morning, Kedusha, what is Kedusha about? If we invented God, or God came before, I don't even want to go into that. But is the Kedusha that people will be able to live well on the earth with each other? Is that what the laws are for? Like, whatever shape or form they are. But if we are sanctifying, like, what does that mean? Because I was thinking today of my grandfather who died in the Warsaw Ghetto. And the last words to my mom, he said, go in the Jewish way. And I was thinking, what's the Jewish way? If it is Kedusha and you put aside a day, and is it that we work and then on that day we take time off to reflect and everything, and to see, so that we can continue to live a life of Kedusha. But it doesn't seem like there's other laws that make it impossible to think that everyone can live well together.
It's a good question, because on the one hand, I could give a really mundane answer and say, well, Kedusha is just behaving in this kind of separate way that is described, in the Torah, right? It's almost a sense of separateness, right? And maybe there's something special about that separateness, right? Because in theory, like, the thing that there's only one of is much more exciting than the thing that there are 99 of. But right, which isn't necessarily an elevation necessarily. But I think, if you look through chapter 19, you start to get a sense of, when we talk about living with a sense of Kedusha, the Torah is fairly specific, right? You honoring your parents, no idols, this idea of caring for the poor, right? When one of the laws of the holiness code, right? When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest, and don't pick your vineyard bare, right? It's caring for the straight, right? So it's you are separate, right, as this holy nation, which means that you have a special, as a I think about Goy Kadosh no, that's not right. Goy Kadosh Kohanim or something, right? What is it? A nation of priests and a holy nation, right? Is what the Israelites are told. So what does it mean to be a nation of priests and a holy nation? It means that, like the priests represent God to the people, and the people, and the Israelites to God, the Israelites, or you could argue like we Jews, and it's going to sound kind of exclusive, but I don't think it's meant to be. It places an extra sort of a higher expectation or an extra burden, perhaps, right? That the Jews represent God to the world and the world before God, right? Think about like our liturgy on Rosh Hashanah in particular, which is very universalistic. But part of what what we're praying for on Rosh Hashanah is not just our a good year for us, either as individuals or as Jews, but like that the world, the people of the world are also, we're saddling this burden. So it's an interesting question, that kind of, what does it mean to be holy? Like, is it that you're just extra special? Or I would argue the Torah says you're special, but that specialness, that separateness comes with some duties. And we've seen, right, through Jewish history that sense of being set apart and unique has also come at a cost throughout Jewish history, right? We have been singled out by other groups. We have been, denigrated and killed and insulted, all the horrible things that have befallen. And at the same time, we're still here. There's kind of an interesting question. Does look at Haman and Hitler and all of those most evil foes that we've had are for the most part footnotes in history, and the Jews are still, right. So it's an interesting question of how we relate to this idea of holiness, both as sort of, I think, an obligation, maybe as a burden, maybe as something that lifts us up, but I think it's all of those things kind of combined into one. Shelley, and then Ellen.
So reading about the loss of Aaron's sons and his silence brings to mind Rachel Goldberg Pollen, who has been speaking, teaching, and writing about her experience in relation to the abduction and then murder of her son Hirsch. And at the same time, I think she's like attained a certain type of holiness in that, both because people who hear her and listen to her understand that she's experienced something and been through something that, God forbid the rest of us hope to never experience. And she herself has expressed that she felt close to God. And so it's both kind of striking, that as we talk about Aaron's sons being wiped out in their efforts to approach God, and just to think about this remarkable woman who understandably could just be hiding, could just be totally shut down,
living under her blankets,
living, not wanting to talk about it, etc.
And would be totally justified in that response as well, right?
Absolutely. And yet she's drawing on something that I think is an expression of a kind of holiness in tragedy, if that makes sense.
And there's also, as you were talking about it, there's something interesting, kind of going back to what Giora was saying about that holiness of the land. Part of what the rabbis are able to do in letting go of the sacrificial system is, as opposed to saying there's this one kind of place through which you relate to God. This idea of avodah shebalev, a sacrifice of the heart, you can access God anywhere, right? You don't have to come to a particular place, and which is true of Jewish tradition throughout history. But the rabbis, I think, sort of shift the emphasis from the way in which we participate in sort of like Jewish religious life, being focused on sacrifice and Jerusalem, now we direct our prayers to Jerusalem, but we can do that from, 6,000 miles away, or next door, right? Or up in Yavne town. And so on some level, it takes a little bit of the danger of Kedusha out of the equation almost, and says, look, it's a striving, it's a longing, right? It's the idea of, when we talk about sacrifice, the word korban has in it the word karov, which means to draw near, to come close. So this idea of kind of sacrifice of the heart, I think the rabbis kind of, not only do they untether it from a specific place, but they untether the kind of physicality of it. It's much more of a kind of psycho-spiritual process. As you were talking, Shelley, I have not read Rachel Goldberg Poland's book yet, which is on my night shelf, in a big stack. Just keeps growing. But I was at a talk about. Our member Lisa Solomon works at the design school at Stanford and focuses on. She's a futurist and sort of thinks about how do we construct systems to build more resilient futures now. And in she spoke at the CCAR conference a few weeks ago. And she actually pulled this quote from Rachel Goldberg Poland. She said, and it's not perfectly in line with what you were saying, but it's a quote from her that I have that is lovely. It's not unrelated. She says she's talking about Passover, I think, is the context for this. And she says, we have a funny relationship with remembering, we Jews, because remembering can be very grounding or it can be very drowning. We have to be very careful with what we do with how we remember things. It is self-defining. Don't forget where you come from. Don't forget what you're made of. Don't forget what you believe in. Don't forget what your values are. So, a pretty powerful sentiment from her specifically, sort of, because to your point, like not only is she the mother of someone who was killed, while he was abducted, she's a deeply religious, she's almost, it almost reminds me of Heschel, right? In a different kind of way, right? Heschel's activism was completely tethered to his to his theology, right? To his understanding of what our duty is as Jews. And I would argue that I think so much, every time I've heard Rachel Goldberg Poland speak, so much of how she's navigating this impossible moment seems so deeply rooted in her understanding of what her Judaism is and how it animates her life, which is pretty profound. Ellen, go ahead.
Shabbat Shalom, Ellen Ratner. So I have a couple of comments. One is, if you are of a certain age, you will remember that Rabbi Axelrod of blessed memory brought a goat to Yom Kippur to the children's service. My children that are now adults remember this specifically because the goat pooped and everybody started to scream. So my thought,
As goats do, yeah.
My thought reading this.
Somebody told the goat it was coming to shul.
That's right.
That must have
He
been
didn't know.
Best manners.
So
is a goat's going to do what a goat's going to do.
A goat's going to do what a goat's going to do. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my thought when I read this about the animals, are the cleanup people behind them? I can't help the picture of this, how improbable this is. The thing that Rabbi Axelrod did is every year at Yom Kippur, is the rabbi bringing a goat? That was the reason that brought my little kids to shul. And the other comment is when Rabbi Martyr taught a class on anti-Semitism, which I remember, she pointed out that we as Jews are an irritant in the society in which we live because we separate our food, our services, our Shabbat, et cetera, and it irritates the surrounding population because we won't conform.
Because we're a stiff-necked people, right? We're a stiff-necked people, and yeah, we won't conform. Historically, like we've been very unwilling to assimilate, right? Like, no, we are going to maintain our separate identity, and that matters to us. Like, we are not and on some level, even if you look at the story of America, right, even the way in which Jews assimilated is also very Jewish, right? We did it in such a Jewish way. Like, we're going to start Hollywood, right? Because they won't take us anywhere else. We're going to start this, and we're going to like make the best Christmas song ever. Take that, Goyim. I don't know. Hold on. There were a couple. Janet on Zoom, and then Elaine.
Okay, so this, I wasn't sure if I should say this because it doesn't have anything to do with the Kedoshim discussion, but I'm confused about why they needed the manna if they have all these animals.
That's a good, well, the manna is sustaining them from day to day. And look, I mean, on some level, my sense is Randy on Zoom today. My hunch is Randy would say, you know, a poor society that is an agrarian society, like you're not killing animals all the time, right? Maybe you're keeping chickens that you're like eating regularly, but these big animals only get slaughtered at special moments when you know that like the whole community is going to be able to gather, to consume this thing. So I think that's part of it. You know, I had in college, I had lived for a while with a friend of mine who was Orthodox and vegetarian, and did actually a fair amount of research into, because there's some interesting stuff in the Orthodox world about whether or not, frankly, it's kosher to be a vegetarian, because there's kind of a sense in the Orthodox community in particular that like, not only do you try to eat meat on Shabbat, but you're supposed to eat meat on Shabbat, kind of to really like, likvod Shabbat, to honor Shabbat. Especially like if you look at, I feel like it's there in the in Fiddler on the Roof, right? That they're having chicken for dinner or something, because even these very poor societies, chicken or fish even, but in these very poor societies, like in order to make Shabbat something holy, when you were eating like, potatoes and bread and rice the rest of the week, like you were getting your protein on Shabbat, right? You were eating meat on Shabbat to elevate it, to lift it up, to make
They
it
also got quail.
right. So that's probably like the equivalent of chicken.
Yeah,
I've
but
seen we have quail on Beth
came to
Hoff's
them
campus. They're not particular, it's not a huge meal.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, so that's my hunch is the manna was kind of the more regular sustenance that was, and they complain about that as well, right? And they remember the what is it, the cucumbers and the delicious and the fish from Egypt, right? There's that moment when they're complaining about the manna. Let's see, Elaine and then Giora.
Yeah, so this was, I think, Earth Week or Earth Day, and it's interesting to look at how the Earth is treated, because way back in the Bible, when the first son is killed, God says to Cain, the Earth is crying out
With the blood of your
spilled blood.
Yeah.
And so there was this different view of the Earth as being alive in a sense, and with emotion and caring and reacting. And of course, it's created out of the substance of God. So like that should be holy too. And then then kind of the devolution of how the earth is looked at. And, we had a whole big push about taking care of the earth. And now it's like, okay, now we're going to mine places or drill places or whatever. And this whole environmental movement is going differently.
Yeah.
But then there's this tension of trying to see the earth as holy in itself, whatever the boundaries are, the markers of different countries, but the earth itself is being holy and not particularly caring or destroying it. I mean, look at all the destruction happening all over the world in wars. I mean, it's just
Right.
so
Yeah.
I think it's a tension about that, and I think it's a great loss when people kind of don't see the earth as holy.
Look, I mean, and that tension, think about the way in which the Torah is structured. And again, kind of to Uriel's point, right? If it's the word of God, or if it's humans trying to understand the divine or the world around them, in the origin story which we have inherited, the first 2 chapters of Genesis lean right into that tension that you're speaking. It's funny. I'm thinking, just as an aside, I think it was Uri Feinberg said, when you're looking at a map of the Middle East, when you see straight lines on the map, those are drawn by European countries. Like, there are no straight lines in the Middle East. Like, borders are natural occurring border, right? The Jordan River is a border between countries. But if you see a straight line, some European general was dividing up the land, which is true of the Middle East. Anyway, but those tensions, look, I think in chapter 1 of Genesis, we're told that our humans are told, you will rule over the earth. So that, I think, is very much one human tendency, is the earth is at our disposal to squeeze as much as we need out of it, and it is here for us, to serve us. And chapter 2 is a much different approach to the world around us. It's a partnership with God, right? You're going to till. Your job as humans is to till and tend the earth, and those are very different approaches. Soloveitchik talks about, like, the lonely man of faith, right? The difference between those 2 poles, and Soloveitchik says, we're both atoms, right? We have both of those poles in us. It's sort of, which one are we leaning into in any given moment? And it's not an easy question, because it's both. Kiora?
Thank you. All of this discussion remind me a funny story from Israel, which I read, because about the non-religious people in Israel. Most of the non-religious people in Israel actually don't believe in God. They don't believe in the Torah. Ben Gurion himself says there was never Egypt, and things so on. So they don't believe in anything written in the Torah or in God. The only thing that the non-religious people in Israel believe is God gave the land to the Jews. The rest they don't believe anything.
Yeah. See, it's select, right? That right there is the definition of kedusha, right? It's the kedusha of memory, right? What you pick, what you select, and what you let go of. All right. With that, we're gonna rise for Kaddish Derabanan. Let the glory of God be extolled. Let God's great name be hallowed in the world, whose creation God willed. May God's great soon prevail in our own day, our own lives, and the life of all Israel. And let us say Amen. Let God's great name be blessed forever and ever. Let the name of the Holy One of blessing be glorified, exalted, and honored, though God is beyond all the praises, songs, and adorations that we can utter. And let us say Amen. God of heaven and earth, grant abundant peace to our people and their leaders, to our teachers and their disciples, and to all who engage in the study of Torah here and everywhere. Let there be for them and for us all grace, love, and compassion, a joyful life, sustenance, and the hope of your sovereignty. And let us say Amen. For us, for all Israel, and for all humanity, may the blessing of peace and the promise of life come true. And let us say Amen. May the one who causes peace to reign in the high heavens, let peace descend on us, on all Israel, and all the world. And let us say Amen. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.